Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Aline Potvin, and today I'll be talking about herbal support for change makers. In my practice, I work with a lot of people that work out in their communities, are potentially, have work in social services, and or are nurses. People that are really doing groundwork in their communities and in the facilities that they work in. And as you can imagine, many of them are pretty burnt by the time they come in to work with me. And a lot of it does come down to, not not being encouraged to practice self care as they work and as they go through and work in their communities. And so a large part of what we end up having to do together is really help find ways for them to be able to do that, large or small. And self-care, as a, I guess, an idea, is something that really became much more much more prominent or focused within the civil rights movement, actually. The idea of radical self-care or self-care as a radical act really came about at that time, and and certainly is just as important today as it would have been then. Um, but it's not something that people typically think that they can do for themselves. And herbal medicine, I'm just going to say that herbal medicine is one way in which we can support people on that foundational level. Um, Really, I like to encourage people to define self-care for themselves and what that means for themselves. And it's going to be different for everybody. But for the purpose of today, we're going to talk about how can we use herbal allies, plants, to initiate self-care. And some of the themes that I find it's so fascinating the way that plants oftentimes mirror the people that need them most, or the situations that the people are living in or experiencing that need them most. I find it so interesting when I was looking through some of the plants I wanted to talk about today, how so many of them thrive in disturbed space. They exist in space, or exist best in space where there's been a lot of construction, a lot of soil turnover. And they also, several of them, live in relationship with other plants very distinctly. And I think that that's very common in any sort of, I guess, work or space where people are trying to make a larger foundational change. They have to rely and work in conjunction with their community as well. So it's kind of interesting how some of these plants um, have that characteristic as well. Now, some of the plants, by virtue of how nourishing and supportive that they can be to the body from a physiological perspective, kind of the one of the outcomes of that is that there is a stimulus for connectivity and being able to reach out more effectively, and I would say being able to respond more effectively as opposed to react. Once you have some of those foundational nutritional things down, etc., as you can probably all relate to, if you're if you missed lunch and you're hungry, the meeting you have after after you've missed lunch is going to be a lot more productive if you actually get a snack in or an actual lunch in first. If not, then you're not going to be able to react to that colleague, that meeting, etc., very effectively. And so herbs can kind of be used in that way as well. They're incredibly nourishing and nutritive. A lot of the herbs that I'm going to talk about today are very soothing, and they're soothing of the nervous system, they're supportive of the heart, and they calm the liver. If we think about herbs from a Chinese medicine perspective and their characteristics or their qualities, that's something that's going to come up a lot in what I'm talking about here. And when we say calm the liver, in Chinese medicine, the liver is the organ through which all qi flows. And it is, if stagnation occurs, which is a common Chinese medicine diagnosis, when there's stagnation in the liver, then you end up with emotions such as frustration, anger, and potentially depression. And so a lot of the herbs are physiologically supportive of the liver, but also address that emotional component as well. The adrenal glands, are the glandular tissue that sit on top of our kidneys that are responsible for our both short-term and long-term stress responses. The hormones that get produced there are responsible for that. And so, as you can imagine, people that are under even, low grade but very long-term stress that are out there doing work in the community truly require, the opportunity to be very mindful of their adrenal health and just what their adrenals are doing. Some additional themes that we'll see in some of these herbs is that several of them what we call harmonizing. They hold herbal formulas together, and they also in Chinese medicine, everything is relative to another thing, and so what that means is that when we use herbs, we have to look at things relative to that individual. So while somebody's, hormones may be off the chart, if we're looking at certain lab values, they're off the chart or they're really low, we have to consider that that's relative to them and may actually be part of their constitution. That being said, you have to make sure to address deficiencies or excesses, but everything is relative to what's going on in that individual in general. And so when we talk about harmonizing, we're referring to how do we kind of bring things into balance with the way that everything is supposed to be related within this particular person's body. So it's very individualized. It's one of my favorite things about using herbal medicines is how they tend to harmonize. Nourishing is also something that often goes out the window when people are very busy and rushed and work in kind of fast-paced or just really intense spaces. And so nourishing is a foundational component of any of these herbal actions. Another important thing that comes up and is a huge part of self-care for people people that work with other people on a community level, potentially in social services or healthcare or what have you, is being able to establish your own boundaries and recognize your limitations. That is a huge, huge component of self-care. And I think it's kind of interesting that, when we look at plants and harvesting them and using them to make our own individualized medicines and formulas, that we also have to honor the boundaries and the limitations of the plant itself. And by that I mean particularly in the harvest part of that process. If we're harvesting chaga, for example, going into a space and not harvesting all of the chaga, being respectful of the process it took for that to get to where it is, and not overstepping boundaries in the harvesting, understanding the limitations of the herbal medicines that we have, and recognizing when we need to try something different as well. So kind of as a theme that runs throughout all of the care that this can provide. So, managing anger and grief and trauma is a topic in and of itself. Of course, but it's something that is oftentimes part of the self-care process. And in addition to that, considering generational anger and grief as well, looking at ancestors and work there. So, these are some of the things that will come up in conversation as I bring you through some of these herbs. And so just keep that in mind. Now, some of the herbs that we're going to talk about today do not come across as being your typical self-care supportive herbs. A lot of times when we say that, people will think, oh, it has to be something that is directly acting on the nervous system, or it's only an adrenal tonic. But the wonderful thing about herbal remedies is that they work in multifaceted ways. And so, again, sometimes, things like ginseng, for example, would be a wonderful adrenal herb, but it might be so stimulating to a person that they can't handle it, even though they might need some adrenal support. And so something else like kelp, which has tons of minerals in it, it's a more nutritive support of the adrenals, would actually be more appropriate. And so some of these don't have, that direct nervous system or adrenal focus, but I find them to be working in a larger way. And that's part of the reason, that's part of what I'm trying to illustrate here, is that it's individualized, and it's also, a lot of times with herbs, there's an old saying that in herbalism, it's better to know 12 purposes for one plant than to know one purpose for 12 plants. And it's so easy to do because plants are complex like that, from a biochemical perspective. And also from just, depending on where they grow or where they're cultivated, they're going to be different as well. So they're very individualized. So the herbs we're going to be talking about today are kelp, nettles, hawthorn, evening primrose, Andra berries, Ramona roots, and chaga. Just a little smattering for you. And again, honestly, so many herbs can apply from a self-care restorative perspective. These are just a handful that I picked out for today. So let's talk about kelp first. Here in Maine, where I practice, it is something that is very readily commercially available. We have three species of this brown algae that is commercially available. We have sugar kelp, winged kelp, and horsetail kelp. And there are, kelp is a general term that we use to describe several species within the brown algae grouping. And so we use many different varieties. And if you go to a health food store, it's usually just packaged as a kelp, or a kombu is also what they call it. And when I look at kelp, again, going back to the characteristic of the plant and where it grows, or in this case, the algae and where it grows, kelp has to be an incredibly resilient structure, an organism, because it is growing in, subtidal zone. It is growing in the ocean, which is incredibly taxing. It has evolved, this algae has evolved to live in an extreme environment, and it's lasted forever. These are some of the oldest organisms that we have. And as a result, because it has been so much exposed to disturbed space, over time it has evolved to have incredibly high amounts of structural minerals. So very rich in calcium. Iodine is probably what it's best known for, but in addition to that, manganese, the electrolytes, potassium, sodium, zinc, chromium, and copper. And what's also really great about seaweed too is that they essentially produce their own, or they are in relationship with their own microbiome. There's bacterial species that live along the fronds, and also are responsible for making certain B vitamins to a certain extent, and that's going to all differ depending on where the algae is growing, what season it is, what it's exposed to, with the changing composition of our oceans. Seaweeds are actually incredibly beneficial to counter the acidification of our oceans. So they're kind of like our ocean activists. So bottom line, seaweeds and kelp species in particular are incredibly nutritional and hardy herbs to use. And so, oftentimes I'll recommend this in powdered form that they can encapsulate or put into smoothies. It can be taken as a tincture, but I also generally have people that incorporate it into meals. So they can use it to create stocks or stews, or just throw it in with a soup as it's being cooked. The cool thing about a lot of seaweeds is that they stimulate what we call umami, which enhances the flavor of anything that you cook. So it's quite nice like that as a natural flavor enhancer. Now, one thing that I would be, generally we're using seaweeds as a nutritive base, heavy in minerals. It's really helpful in cases where there's wasting, extreme fatigue, or very deep nutritional deficiency, which is so common for people that are just kind of busting their butts, working out in the community and not necessarily taking time to care for themselves nutritionally, or they just aren't able, or their digestive system is so disturbed by stress that they cannot absorb nutrients. And so this is a nice way to get in minerals in a super stew fashion. It's also been commonly used for thyroid dysfunction, which is not unusual for people that experience long-term stress. My only caution for that would be that, just because somebody has hypothyroidism doesn't mean that they're iodine deficient. And in fact, most people in the US have an autoimmune hypothyroidism. And in that case, some of the really heavy iodine supplementation could actually be more harmful than helpful. And so kelp species, being particularly high in iodine, can be not necessarily the best seaweed choice right off the bat. Perhaps that something like nori would be more appropriate. That has a higher protein content, but not as high in iodine content, generally speaking. So we have, kelp, again, just being this really wonderful, nutritive, restorative plant, algae. And so I recommend it to many people, not just people that are kind of trying to make their way through difficult workspaces. Another very nutritive herb is nettle. And generally here you're using the aerial parts of the plant, the leaves. However, the root is also used in support of prostate health. And so the great thing about nettle is that it is, again, another one of those herbs that is found in disturbed space. Nettle really likes phosphate, and humans have do a really good job at increasing phosphate in the surroundings that they set themselves down into. And so nettles thrive, on the edges of parking lots, around industrial complexes, along disturbed stream beds. They kind of go where the going is going to be a little bit rough for anything else. So they're pretty brave. And what I love about nettle is, it's a common saying is that, when in doubt, give nettle, because it really can be supportive for most people. The only thing that I would obviously caution is that if somebody does have kidney issues, or they tend to be a really super hot person, this constitutionally may not be the best herb for them because it is more warming and drying, and will influence fluid in the body. But we use nettle because it has such a rich mineral composition. And in addition to that, it seems to be quite helpful for allowing a person to assimilate the protein that they get into their diet. For whatever reason, it's kind of unclear as to how that actually works. But when nettle is taken with, or is taken by a person who is trying to also increase their protein, they have an easier time assimilating the protein that they do get in. And so it can be incredibly helpful for cases where there's significant amounts of atrophy and stagnation. There's protein deficiency or mineral deficiency, because it works on allowing for better tissue exchange and better circulation. It helps reduce things like edema or swelling, inflammation of the urinary system. It brings that down as well. And I think kind of indirectly, because of the increased nutritional status, you can see increase of concentration and mental acuity with nettle over the long term, of course. And in addition to that, improving nutritional status also allows for hair, decreased hair loss and skin repair as well. So nettles is just, it's just really, really nourishing and fortifying. Now, hawthorn is another shrub, small tree, herb that will be one of the first things to establish itself on disturbed soil. And I love that because, hawthorn is also known as being a really important heart tonic, cardiovascular tonic, and from an energetic perspective, also a heart tonic as well. And so I just think it's just one of the sweetest things to show up at the first signs of disturbance. And we generally use it as a tea. It can be found in tincture form, and also powder form of the berry. So we generally are using mostly berries with these preparations, though sometimes you can get other components of the plant in your mixes as well. And we generally use it to improve blood flow to the heart muscle itself, and to nourish that heart muscle, in addition to the vessels. So when we see poor circulation, this is a really key remedy. And it also, from a Chinese medicine perspective, does what we call removing empty heat. And empty heat in Chinese medicine is what will lead to things like insomnia, restlessness, anxiety, and so it has this kind of calming effect as well. And generally speaking, if you're using it as a flower essence, is a wonderful heart tonic as well. Next, we have evening primrose, and we generally do not think about evening primrose as being, supportive from a stress perspective, because we know most people are well aware of the oil being used, the seed oil being used as an anti-inflammatory, being really high in GLA. However, the plant component itself is also indicated when a person has significant muscular tension and nervous tension. And the great thing about evening primrose is that it's what we call a moonlight plant. It is asleep during the hottest part of the day, and it is in its full glory through the evening. So it has that very divine feminine type of energy about it. in a lot of ways. But the plant matter itself is bitter, but also very demulcent, and so it has a mild effect on the nervous system, reducing that kind of stressful or tense energy. But it also can be really helpful in cases of things like dry cough. People get, people that are stressed out get colds and flus all the time just because their immunity gets lowered by the stress response. But additions to certain cough remedies like evening primrose extract can be helpful in that regard because of its demulcent factor. And you don't see extracts of evening primrose plant very frequently. It's something you would probably have to make yourself. I would generally recommend it as a tea as opposed to a tincture, but it does have a bitter quality to it, so just be mindful of that. But just a beautiful, very pleasant plant that we oftentimes forget about. We only think about its seeds and its oil, which are helpful as well. But Andra Berry is one of my favorite herbs. We're using the berries as the part of the plant that's used. And we prep it in a few different ways. You can take that as a powder. I really like using the powdered berries and making a strong decoction and drinking it all back. You can make a tea, you can make a tincture, but it's used in a lot of Chinese medicine formulas as what we call a harmonizer. Because if you taste a single Schizandra extract, what you'll notice is that it actually has all 5 flavors to it. And so it was seen as a harmonizer that would bind a formula together and create unity within the formula. But some of the over masking characteristics of the flavor is that it's very, or that, once you try the tincture or the powder or whatever you have, is that it has a astringent end to it, and it's quite warming. And I find it to be an incredibly uplifting herb. But it has very direct action on the adrenals as an adaptogen and helping, allow for a more appropriate stress response. But it also stimulates the second phase of liver detoxification. So it can act as a liver support. You would want to be mindful if you're taking medications because it does speed up that second half of liver detoxification from a physiological perspective. Traditionally, they've used it as an adrenal support, as a liver support. So removing what we call liver stagnation, I mentioned earlier, it can be very helpful at assisting with that anger, frustration, or depression that can come from that process. It's an incredibly uplifting and supportive herb, and it also has been used traditionally for night sweats and immunodeficiency. So I add it into a lot of formulas for that reason. It's just a delightful herb, and even just looking at the berries is kind of uplifting too. The next herb that I really enjoy as a restorative herb for people working out in the community is Ramona. A really common theme for people that are existing under that kind of stress is difficulty sleeping. And from a Chinese medical perspective, what they thought that insomnia came from a few different sources, but generally speaking, they thought that insomnia came from the Shen, or the ethereal soul, wandering at night and not being able to sleep. And your Shen is housed within your heart, and so from a Chinese herbalism perspective, a lot of the herbs that they use to manage stress and insomnia have not necessarily a direct heart action, but they work on the ethereal heart. And so Ramona is one of those, and it's something that I oftentimes will think of when people have very restless sleeps, difficulty staying asleep, um, or they might have dreams or nightmares at night as well. Um, and it's such a pretty flower, but what we actually end up using from Romania is the root. And depending on what what your treatment goal is, traditionally they've used it either as a toasted root or a non-toasted. But you can powder that root. It can be cooked or uncooked. You can use it as a tincture or a salad extract. And it's sweet and slightly warm, particularly when it's been cooked. And this is really excellent for what we call yin deficiencies or lack of substance. One of the leading causes of that heart disturbance that I was talking about earlier that causes your shen to wander around at night was that there was considered a yin deficiency, and yin is yin is substance that grounds your ethereal soul down. And so, from a Chinese herbal perspective, a lot of the herbs were meant to pin down or bring substance to the ethereal soul, to ground it. And and so Romania has been used for insomnia, for hypertension, for empty heat conditions that come from that deficiency of yin. So if there's not a lot of substance, or yin, which is more cooling and grounding, you end up with heat that's produced and ungroundedness, which translates symptomatically to things like restlessness, insomnia, irritability, etc. They've also used it traditionally for palpitations, but also, even from a Western perspective, they started to explore Romania as a tonic to be used in cases of autoimmune disease, certain autoimmune diseases. And this is a really interesting connection, because it's something that I see a lot in people that do things like social services and nursing and jobs or roles where they have to be taking care of others. There seems to be a really significant incidence of autoimmune disease where the immune system actually attacks your own tissues. So, working on a case of autoimmunity is actually kind of the ultimate self-care, because you have to convince your own body that that you are of self, and therefore shouldn't be broken down by your own immune system. So it's tricky, but there's been a lot of really interesting studies that show that it's actually Romania is actually quite a promising herb in that regard. But of course, it's dependent on what kind of autoimmunity you're experiencing. And lastly, the last herb I want to talk about is chaga, and this is, of course, a mushroom. We're generally using the entire fruiting body, and this is, an herb that is actually has a very significant specific relationship with another plant, or with a plant. Chaga is not a plant specifically, but they're found on white birches, high or low. And something to be mindful of, because chaga has become kind of this big craze for foragers in the last 5 to 10 years, is that chaga, again, this kind of speaks to the maintenance of boundaries when we use herbs for our own benefit. Chaga can be found on approximately 1 out of every 15,000 birch trees. And oftentimes when you find fruiting bodies that are to the degree that you see in this picture here, they've taken, up to 25 years to establish themselves and to that size. And so just being very mindful of not over harvesting or stripping away, these fruiting bodies kind of carelessly, just being mindful of the boundaries of the herb you're trying to get to. But we generally will use these as a decoction, but even more effectively as a double extraction. So you do a water extraction or an alcohol extraction and then make a water extraction from what's what's being taken out of the alcohol extract and then mixing those two together. And there you get both water soluble components of the chaga and the alcohol soluble components of the chaga. So it's a more complete complex. But generally, medicinal mushrooms are used as immunostimulants, as incredibly nutritive factors, and it's something that can be taken regularly in support of immune status and therefore boundaries. From a Chinese medicine perspective, you're what we call wei qi, which is your immunity that floats underneath the skin and over all of the organs, is considered one of your most important boundaries. And so, in the spirit of establishing boundaries from that more ethereal perspective, supporting things that support your immunity is actually key for your overall well-being. And so chaga is a good choice for that. Oftentimes, though, medicinal mushrooms taken in larger quantities will thin the blood. So just be mindful of that if you have issues with clotting, as it is. And again, like I always tell everybody that I work with or that I teach, just be mindful of herbs are delightful and can be so helpful for people, but you have to make sure that it's right for you and that you aren't taking something that will interact with other stuff that you're taking. So just be responsible with that. But that's all for today. I hope that you guys enjoyed that. I will likely be putting out more herbal talks as the year progresses. But thank you, and I hope you all have a really great day.